Thanks so much for being here. If it is your first time attending a webinar hosted by Auggie, I am honored and humbled that you chose this session to join. And if you have been at any of my other sessions, you know that I am a Faster Way certified coach who is focused on helping moms gain energy, lose stubborn fat, and build healthy, sustainable habits. But today, I am just coming to you as someone who experienced a pretty traumatic loss and had a really, really hard time going back to work. So today we're going to talk about some sensitive topics, including pregnancy loss, baby loss, and I know that these can be really triggering to some. So please only watch this if you are in a state to do so. And finally, little disclaimer that I am not a doctor or a licensed counselor. This session is really just meant to open a dialogue about real life tragedies, but it is not a substitute for medical advice from your trusted healthcare provider. I am simply a woman who felt completely alone and isolated and lost after loss. And so I really am focused and passionate about breaking the stigma around mental health, particularly for women and grieving mothers. And because navigating pregnancy loss does not come with a job description, it requires more grace and space and support than the world might be used to giving. And so you deserve to feel seen and have your boundaries respected and have your healing honored in a way that is important to you. And I also want to acknowledge that today, October 15th, is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Remembrance Day. So this is a day to honor and remember those who have been affected by pregnancy loss and infant death. And that comes in the form of miscarriage, stillbirth, ectopic pregnancies, SIDS, and other accidents. And so today, there is also what is called the Wave of Light, where people around the world light a candle at 7 p.m. local time, and it creates a 24-hour wave of light across the globe. And that's done in remembrance of lost babies. In some communities, they also have in-person events, and so I encourage you to look up to see if there is one in your community today. They are very emotional, but also really, really awesome events to attend. And I also want to give some context around just me and my loss. And so I had a ruptured ectopic pregnancy at 8 weeks and 6 days. I was 3 days away from my ultrasound appointment, and I was truly shocked. I had never even heard of an ectopic pregnancy. And so my heart, my body, and my mind were all shattered. And just the thought of going back to work the next day was very disorienting, exhausting, not to mention like terribly isolating. I didn't know who to reach out to. I didn't know what to do. And so what I realized through my own experience is that while pregnancy loss is devastatingly common, most workplaces are not equipped to respond with a level of compassion and care, let alone support, that most women and even men need. And I do want to acknowledge men as well, because even though they did not have the child inside of them, obviously they lost too. And so that is really important. So the first and possibly most important thing that I just want to bring up today is knowing what employers have in terms of benefits, which is a really terrible word to use in this situation, but thinking about the types of leave. And so some pregnancy losses are covered in bereavement leave, some are covered in short-term disability, and so it's really important for you to look into and know your rights as it relates to pregnancy loss. Also, some companies offer therapy or counseling. So Modern Health is a good example. Sometimes they have coaching or therapy and counseling options. Meditation apps like Calm and Headspace. And if your employer doesn't have those directly available, sometimes there are stipends for wellness, flex wallets, that kind of thing that you could use for one of those. So it's really important to know what is available to you and what you're entitled to. That said, I also want to encourage you to open lines of communication. That's really important. Now, not all people are going to be comfortable sharing about their experiences. For me, I'm a very open book, but not everyone is. And so when it comes to those open lines of communication, you really have to kind of know your manager and know how much you want to share. And a mentor of mine recently said to me that at some point, corporate America will show you if you matter, and you have to decide if you care if you matter. And so, in instances where pregnancy loss is concerned, my hope is that all managers and coworkers would show at least a little bit of empathy and care and not treat people just as employee ID numbers. But that's not always the case. And so, if you happen to take time off to grieve, going back to work can be really difficult. And that's something that I want to acknowledge and also tell you that you are not alone in feeling that. And so when you do have to go back, for me in particular, I felt a sense of sadness, overwhelm, even frustration. And so on my first day back, someone actually asked me if I was excited to be back to work. And I literally didn't know how to answer. I kind of just looked at them through the camera because I wasn't on vacation. I was mentally and physically recovering from losing my first child and facing my mortality and reading a doctor's note that mentioned a life-threatening situation, and that's a lot to process, and it doesn't just go away. And so just know that all of the feelings that you have are your own, and they are valid when you do have to return to work. And that brings me to the idea of micro boundaries. And so instead of these big sweeping changes or dramatic declarations, setting really small micro boundaries can help you protect your energy without drawing a lot of unwanted attention. And so a few examples of this are turning off your notifications for 10 minutes in between meetings. So if you have Slack or Teams, just pausing those notifications to give yourself a little break, to give your mind a little break. Also choosing not to explain your absence in an email or a status or whatever means of communication you and your team have. Simply just put out of office. If you work from home at the end of the day, shut the laptop, literally close it. Close the office door if you have one. Turn off the light. When it's time to be done with work, be done. And I know that it's really easy to bury ourselves in work, especially when we're grieving, but having that micro boundary can be really good for your mental health. And then for managers in particular, I know that a lot of managers work hours that are outside of what, the standard kind of antiquated 8 to 5 is. But that also really makes people feel like they have to be online or that they're going to miss something. And so if you have the ability to schedule messages, I highly recommend doing that, especially for employees that are grieving, so that they don't feel an extra sense of burden or stress. And at the very least, if you're sending emails, adding kind of a well-being notice at the bottom of your email signature. So something along the lines of, hey, or if you're receiving this outside of normal working hours, managing work and life responsibilities is unique for everyone. And so I've sent this email at a time that works for me. Please respond at a time that works for you. And so just, putting that out there of the acknowledgement that not everyone works the same hours. And then another thing that I would recommend, particularly for managers or coworkers, is not shaming people for being off camera. So Zoom fatigue, especially when you are feeling fragile, is a very real thing. And so that micro boundary of not having to be on camera if you're in a remote setting can really help you protect your capacity while still allowing you to participate in the day-to-day. And then I also just want to take a minute to really talk about communication. So obviously, a lot of people work in the remote setting these days, but there is still people who go into the office, which is great. And so one thing that can be done both in person and in a virtual environment is code word communication. So if you have a trusted coworker or manager, establishing some kind of nonverbal or even shorthand to let someone know you're having a really hard day is really important, because the one thing that I learned through my loss is that grief is not linear. And sometimes it just comes rushing on like a wave. And so having a way to let someone know that you might need a little extra space or patience that day is really important. So maybe it's sending a specific emoji. Maybe it's using a phrase like, hey, I'm going to be heads down today. Something that communicates the need for space without explanation. But by having that code word, you really can help prevent the emotional exhaustion of having to keep explaining your grief and explaining what you're going through over and over and over again. And then another type of code word or phrase that I used was, I was in Hawaii. And basically that code meant that I had gotten lost in my thoughts. I wasn't paying attention. And so it kind of lightens the mood while also acknowledging that you weren't fully present. And so that's totally okay. Again, with grief coming in and out, just that acknowledgement of, hey, I wasn't fully present is totally okay. And then if you're feeling like you need to open the lines of communication and you want to share a little bit more about how you're feeling, but you aren't really sure how, one of the things I started doing was responding in metaphors or analogies or figures of speech rather than simple one word phrases. So, for example, we are so often asked, "How are you?" And we're really conditioned to say, like, "Oh, fine," or "good," or whatever, these one word answers. But I started responding in a way that was really unexpected. And so it kind of opened myself up to a larger conversation if someone wanted to engage with that. So, for example, if I was having a hard day, I might say something like, I'm feeling like a piece of tissue paper in a tornado. I'm kind of whirling around and hanging together by a thread. And so while it can seem lighthearted, it also kind of makes people pause and focus on where you're really at. And then another thing with communication, and honestly, if you're going to write anything down from this session, this would be it, is for managers and even coworkers, is the benefit of asking a coworker, whether they're grieving or not, are you open to feedback? A lot of times I think people just spew out feedback, and especially when you're in a state of grief, you're not always in that headspace to accept that feedback or to hear it. And so if you ask someone, "Hey, are you open to feedback?" then that gives them the chance to say, like, "Yeah, I'm ready to hear it," or, "I'm not really in the headspace today, but let's schedule time for tomorrow." And then that gives the person time to emotionally prepare, an ability to receive the message with more clarity, and to stay engaged without really feeling attacked or unsafe. And then while we're on the topic of verbal communication, we also need to explore the idea of off the cuff phrases. And so this was something that was particularly triggering to me when I went back to work. Some phrases that I heard in my day to day were like, "Oh my gosh, I'm dead." And that was for someone saying something was so funny. Or, "Oh my gosh, I'm dying over here." Or, we're going to bury the competition with this campaign. And so all of those phrases, they seem insignificant, but when you have just experienced pregnancy or infant loss, your whole world feels fragile. And so that means that some of those everyday phrases can be really, really jarring. And so that was something that I had to kind of approach with some of my coworkers of like, "Hey, could you maybe take a pause before saying something like that?" Now, of course, we cannot bubble wrap the workplace, and we can't expect every single person to filter every single word, but a little awareness goes a really long way. And another thing is, I think sometimes our expectations go unsaid, which is never good. And so if we can say, "Hey, my expectation is that we're going to have a little bit more empathy," as a manager, saying that and getting the whole team on board to really rally around someone who's grieving is really important. And then also when we think about communication, it's not just spoken, right? Like we live in a world where a lot is digital. And so when we communicate online, there are things that can also be very triggering. For me in Slack, it was the skeleton emoji or the dead man laying down. Like those things were extremely triggering to me. And so, we can't filter every message, but as a manager, perhaps it's, "Hey, let's remove those emojis from being used and let's find something else to say or do." So, just communication shows up in so many ways. So, it's really important for you to identify kind of what some of those triggers are and then how to approach it with your manager. Now, I know a lot of times when we think about grief, we think about the mental load and processing the emotions. But for me, I also want to acknowledge that it showed up in a really physical way. And so sometimes it was as though sitting in my chair, I could feel my entire body vibrating, and I couldn't control it. Other times I would just get really short of breath all of a sudden. And more often than not, it was really intense tension in my shoulders and back. And so quick body resets throughout the day kind of helped me really ground myself. So some examples are the power pose. Now, if you're not familiar with the power pose, you basically stand up with your feet on the ground, place your arms open or raise them up above your head, and you just stand there for about 15 seconds. Now, I will say, I am big into data and science has largely debunked that the power pose helps boost your confidence and performance and all the other things that it used to be thought to do. But for me, I think just having that positive stance helped me feel more grounded. It helped me just take a pause. And so when we're trying to avoid some of those negative and contracted poses, that really open stance can be really useful. Another thing that can be really helpful is gently pressing your palms together like this for 10 seconds. And so basically the pressure on your hands when you do this sends a signal to your brain that can help lower your stress hormones, things like cortisol. And then it can also kind of activate your parasympathetic nervous system. And so again, just pressing your palms together for 10 seconds. Another one for me that I still do to this day when I'm feeling overwhelmed is gently tapping your collarbone in a rhythmic motion. So when you're feeling anxious, when you're feeling overwhelmed, one of the simplest things you can do is just start tapping your collarbone. And it's part of something called the emotional freedom techniques, or EFT. And the idea is that tapping stimulates your vagus nerve, which signals to the body to relax. And it has worked really, really well for me. Another body-based awareness thing I would do is pushing my feet into the floor as hard as I could and taking a moment to feel the ground beneath me. My therapist described it as grounding, and she told me, try to describe the feeling in as many details as possible of your feet on the ground. And when you really stop to do that, it's amazing what your brain can come up with. And then another thing is taking 60 seconds to take 3 big, long, deep breaths. Something as small as taking a few deep breaths can really shift your entire nervous system. And it kind of activates that rest and restore function and response, signaling to your brain like, hey, I'm safe, and that we can kind of chill out for a minute. And so that is one thing that as managers, if you are hosting a meeting and you know that someone is quietly carrying something really, really heavy, you can have the entire team take those 60 seconds to take those 3 big, long, deep breaths together. And while you're not calling that person out, you create a culture where everyone feels a little bit more grounded, a little more focused, a little more human, and it can be really helpful for those people who are in the grief stage. So all of that said, I also want to just acknowledge that redefining the word professional is something that was life-changing for me. Because reminding yourself that showing up does not always mean performing at 100% is okay when you are carrying something so heavy. And I say that because when I expressed that I was struggling with coming back to work and feeling a little overwhelmed, I was told that I needed to be 100%, and if I wasn't, I needed to let my manager know because they needed my full focus. And, that just didn't hit well with me because I wasn't as bubbly as I used to be. I was still grieving. I didn't contribute as much in meetings because I needed more time to process things. And so, in my opinion, what makes you professional is your presence in the midst of pain and doing the best you can in that season. And the best you can in a season of grief could look very different than who you were, a month prior or 3 months prior, and that's okay. And then another thing that, I had to do when I was feeling particularly overwhelmed was finding ways to be really focused on conversations. Because if I go back to my phrase of I was in Hawaii, I had a really hard time focusing some days. And so what I started doing was grab a sticky note, I'd write a number on it, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and put it on my computer. And that was my goal of how many questions I needed to ask in every single call I was on that day. And so that helped me to focus more on the conversation, to engage in active listening, and to be able to ask follow-up or clarifying questions. And so that was just a really simple reminder for me, like, hey, pay attention and ask something. So those are some of the things that really helped me when I had to return to work after my loss, and hopefully you took 1 or 2 nuggets out of that. But I also want to share a few resources before we wrap up. There are 2 books written by Liz Fosline, and one is called Big Feelings and one is called No Hard Feelings. No Hard Feelings is a book that I would encourage everyone to read, whether you are grieving, supporting a grieving employee, or just a human being. It talks about how to show up with emotions in the workplace, and it's very, very well written. Another resource is the Emotions Wheel. If you just Google it, you can find it. This was something that my therapist provided to me that really helped me name and identify my feelings on a deeper level. So instead of sad, I would go kind of within the wheel and say, you know what, actually today I'm feeling really jealous because I just saw a pregnancy announcement from a relative of mine and I wanted that to be me. And so it allowed me to really identify and name what I was feeling every single day. And then the other thing I would say is I would really encourage you to get connected with a community of people who are going through or have gone through the same thing. For me, the feeling of isolation was particularly heavy, and so finding community was really important. If you are someone who is faith based, Foreknown Ministries is a great to get connected with. They have various online resources, they also do in person gatherings. There's another website called Share Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support. Pardon me for just the Share Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support is for family support, and they offer in person gatherings as well. And they have a whole list of resources by state. And then, pardon. And then another resource is called Sisters in Loss, and they offer educational support for bereavement. Um, and then And then another tip I would say is just asking people what they need to feel seen and appreciated and valued in a time of loss. And so for me, everyone was sending me soup, and by about the fifth box of soup, I was over it. And so one thing that I took away from my loss is when someone's going through something, of offering them specific ways to be supportive. And so maybe it's, hey, I would love to show you care right now in a way that's meaningful to you. Which one of these sounds the best to you? Is it coffee delivery, a meal delivery, flowers, a donation to a certain cause? And so it allows them to not have to think when someone says like, hey, do you need anything? And it's like, I don't know what I need. So offering specific things to people can be really helpful. And so I just want to wrap up by saying that I know if you are going through pregnancy loss, that this season can be really isolating. But what you're going through, even though it is an unimaginable loss, that feeling does shift. It doesn't always go away, but it does shift, and that's okay. And so I know we've covered a lot today, but whether you're grieving or supporting someone who is, I hope that this talk has offered a little bit of a roadmap, not a perfect one, but a real one, of some things we can do for ourselves and to help others with more compassion and more awareness as we return to work after loss. So with that, we will wrap up, and thank you for being here.